We have almost everybody back, and so I think we should proceed. And I want to welcome Tom Flynn. Tom, we first met about 1.5 years ago when Joe and I came to the special seminar for presidents and chairmen of boards, and it was really a very, very worthwhile experience and exercise. And I thank you and your staff for that. I think it provided not only an understanding of a lot of things that we have and we want to talk about today, but also the engagement with other chairmen provided an opportunity for me to have a better understanding of their dilemmas and problems as well as ours. And you find out that it's pretty similar. So with that, Joe, do you want to?
Well, I'll just do that. The formal invitation of Tom. I know we want to keep things moving, but Tom's the senior advisor for consulting services at the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. He's also a senior fellow at the Association of Governing Boards. And besides coordinating ACCU's advising services to members, which is relatively new, he is also a presenter and a mentor to the new President's Institute at ACCU and serving as a lead faculty member for AGB's Institute for Presidents and Board Chairs. And in a past life, I know Tom's also worked with the Council for Independent Colleges, and I think I first met him 6 years ago at the new President's Seminar. So I appreciate Tom's understanding and knowledge in the area. It was natural once we were looking at the nature of this retreat to reach out to him and appreciate him answering the call. And so in general, we'll turn it over to Tom, but this is really, because we have so many new board members, a retreat on what it really means to be a board member at an institution of higher education, but more particularly at a Catholic institution and a Mercy Catholic institution along those lines. So Tom, we are in your capable hands.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Bob, and good morning, everyone. I can only see a couple of you on the screen with the PowerPoint up, but when we get to the first of our discussions, I will look forward to seeing all of you. I gotta start by saying double-barreled congratulations. I've certainly convened a number of my own retreats when I was a college president for about 20 years, and I've led a number in the last several years. I don't think I can ever recall a retreat that was bringing on not only such a large number of new trustees, but a really extraordinarily impressive group, and impressive in terms of the diversity of backgrounds. I will just tell you that you have done extremely well in that regard. And I don't think I have ever come to a board retreat before in which Bob very kindly took me into his confidence about a week ago and briefed me on the exciting developments you have. I suspect that the new trustees sitting there are pinching themselves, because coming on the board at a time like this is about as good as it gets. So congratulations. I'm delighted to be with you. Not only do I go back with Joe 6 years to when he was a brand new president, both at CIC and ACCU, but one of your new trustees, Chris Domes, and I were colleagues for many, many years in the Franciscan world. But most importantly, when Alvernia University, the university I led for 15 years, when we decided in our strategic plan, my second year as president, that we were going to move from college to university, the best piece of advice I was given by one of the senior people at ACCU was call the Mercy sister, who was president of Georgian Court University. And when I met with your president, I took her to breakfast in about the cheapest little dive diner in downtown Manhattan. She teased me mercilessly about that. The best advice that we got in terms of university status came from Rosemarie and other members of your staff. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to thank all of you for the extraordinary contributions that your colleagues made to us 15 years ago when we became a university. Joe teed up the retreat very, very well. There's going to be two parts to it. You have an agenda, and I will alter the time a little bit. We will end no later than 1:30. I'll play with some of the time to make up some time here. Our first session, will be certainly a maximum of an hour. We'll take a short break then. And this first session is really the first part of orientation for the new trustees, but also a review for those of you who are veteran trustees. I look forward to being in person with Joe and Bob and your new trustees at new trustee orientation in the fall. And so this first part of our presentation, as Joe said, is looking at the responsibility of boards overall. Hopefully you had a chance to see Father Dennis's 9 or 10 minute little primer on what it means to be a trustee. And we'll play with some of those concepts during this first hour. We'll talk about expectations and responsibilities. And then after our short break, we will move to governing for mission at both a Catholic university and at a Mercy University, specifically New Jersey's Mercy University. We will have a series of discussion questions throughout the next several hours, and Stephanie and Matt will take the screen down so we can see everybody. But your board, like my own former board, is large enough that I will not be able to see all of you on the screen. So we ask that you raise hands, and Matt will help me make sure we call on people. I will be giving a few little mini talks on some of the subjects that Joe thought were particularly important to put in front of you. And when I reviewed with Bob, he was very interested in some of these. And then I'll stop at a couple of points when I've made some presentations to ask you for any follow-up questions and discussion. So Stephanie, we can move to our opening discussion question. And whether you are a brand new trustee or whether you have been on for a while, I'd like to start by having a number of you say a bit about why you are serving on the Georgian Court University Board. Partly to prompt your own reflection, but also so that your brother and sister trustees can hear some of the varied reasons that brought you to the board. So who wants to start us off? Jim?
I'll start us off. I'm an alum, and I deeply appreciate what Georgian Court gave to me and where it put me in my life then and now. And it is an amazing opportunity to give back, number one. Number two, to be associated with these amazing people is a gift that a board member receives.
Wonderful to have an alum begin the conversation, but I particularly want to call out the last part of what Debbie said, because it's not necessarily why someone joins the board, but one of the real value adds as a trustee, as the veteran trustees know, is the colleagueship and the friendship you develop with fellow trustees. And it's pretty neat to be interacting with some very, very talented people on behalf of a good cause. Jim Andrews, I saw your hand up.
Yes, I'm also an alum in recent years and enjoyed my experience at Georgian Court and my experience at another university being on their foundation board. I realized how volunteers can make a great contribution to the university.
Good, thank you. Amelia? Amelia, you're still muted.
Thank you. I'm going to ditto everything that Debbie said. She was in the class behind me, and I feel that the court, we used to call it the court when we were there, has given me the ability to lead a life that I think was fruitful for others as well as myself. But and the ability to reconnect with people at the college now has been terrific. But I also feel that there's such a need for this kind of a university, for the university that serves the first-time college student, the people who don't have that much money, and the student who might need a little push to walk across campus to get help. I really feel that that's probably right up there amongst the other reasons why I'm still here.
That's wonderful. I don't know your first name. Is it
John,
Don? Yeah,
John,
John, go ahead.
I came on board at the invitation of Sister Rosemary. It was through her explanation and of the mercy values and the role of Catherine McCauley. And it just struck me as exactly where I felt things were really important. It's the only board I serve on, and I serve on a number of them, where we begin the meeting in prayer. And it sets the tone for the whole meeting. And it's been that way for the 12 years I've been on the board. It's been a wonderful experience. And I'm very grateful for having the opportunity.
I'm going to go up to my top left corner to Alicia, and then Frank, and then Jeff.
Hi, everyone. I am an alumna, class of 2008, and I always held a deep appreciation for Georgian Court and for higher education as a whole. Before my current job, I worked in higher ed at St. Peter's University and Bloomfield College for a total of 12 years, so right after graduating Georgian Court. Both schools enrolled students from underserved communities, ones that have been historically excluded from higher ed, and I saw how they were able to better their lives by going to college, earning a degree. And I know nowadays a lot of people often think that you don't need a degree to succeed, but higher ed is more than just handing out degrees. There's a holistic and spiritual growth that happens when you are enrolled at a place like Georgian Court, and that is why I want to be a part of this work.
Good. Thank you. Frank?
I was invited to the board by Sister Rosemary. She and I had shared board tenures at various other places. I knew nothing about Georgian Court. I knew a fair amount about the Mercies. Some of them were clients of the firm that I used to work. And as were Catholic universities, I was always intrigued about having them as clients. I never understood their business model. And so the invitation to come on the board was very selfishly for me an opportunity to learn about how this business runs and why some are successful and why some aren't. What keeps me here is really being surrounded by a lot of very, very smart people, a lot of very, very committed people who I've gotten to work with and know over the years and appreciate the dedication. The other thing that's kept me here has been just the Mercies themselves and the charism of the Mercies. I come out of a De La Salle Christian Brothers tradition. And I think that there's a lot of other institutions can learn from the Mercies in terms of commitment and dedication and the way that they run their institution. So that's what keeps me here.
Well said. Jeff?
Thank you. I was invited onto the board by Bob Mulcahy, who I have tremendous respect and affection for, and I had the opportunity to work with a little bit prior to joining the board. My mother and my sisters are graduates of Georgian Court. And of particular import to me was the experience that my mom had. Graduating college in the late 50s was not a common experience for women. It led to a 50-year career as an educator, and of particularly impactful to me was the relationships that she developed, which continued into her 80s with the women that she'd gone to school with. And the only thing that interfered with those at the end was the health of those women. They had great memories, both academically and socially, and developed the kind of bond that I remember as a kid and as an adult. And so I know it's a special place. I know the special impact it's had on my family in particular.
I'd add so that the board knows, Jeff's a former Attorney General of the state of New Jersey and was the interim US Senator from New Jersey, and now heads one of the major law firms in the state. And we've worked together on a lot of things, and Jeff, I appreciate it.
You know, Joyce Heckman also had her hand up.
Yeah, thank you.
Joyce, and then we'll go to Joyce and then Bess.
Yeah, thank you. And, what Jeff said about the relationships is something that really resonates, with me when I think of, my life and who are the people that I reach out to during the best of times and the worst of times. They're people who I graduated with at Georgian Court. And just want to share a short story. A colleague of mine, we were connecting on LinkedIn, and she didn't know that I went to Georgian Court and vice versa. I never knew she went. And we started sharing stories about Georgian Court. And I think the thing that really struck me is that she attended, many years later than I did. So I would expect her experience would be different, but it really wasn't. She talked about the caring nature of the faculty. She said she got to college and didn't do well her first semester. And she realized she didn't know how to study. And one of the Sisters of Mercy pulled her aside and helped her. And she said it really launched her to have a successful college career. So it's that caring nature of the university, the relationships, the people that you meet. Being with the university has just always been a phenomenal experience. I've spent many years on the alumni board of directors and just have worked with an incredibly group of talented people. So I look forward to contributing more by my participation on the board.
Patricia, we'll give you Patricia and Michelle, we'll give you two the last words.
There are several reasons that I could give, and I won't go into all of them, but in my previous job, before I was semi-retired, I traveled probably about 125,000 miles a year, about 40% of my time. And I always, I'm one of those people that talks to other people on airplanes. So one day there was a young woman next to me. We began talking and I asked what she did for a living. And she was worked with a program in St. Louis that helped young people who would not be able to go to college get into college and to change their lives. So as we talked, I said, well, what led you to this? And she said, well, I went to a little school. She didn't know I was on the board of Georgian Court at this point. I went to a small school in New Jersey that is Catholic. She was a Georgian Court grad. And she said to me, I became convinced of the obligation to reach out to others in social justice. And this has been a guiding force for me. Well, it was not till she was all finished that I told her, that I was on the board, but it's because of the hope of our graduates in changing our future culture, our future environment that I serve on this board.
Thank you. Michelle? No pressure, but you have the last word.
I'd be glad to talk if you need another one.
Okay. You're muted, Michelle.
I'm not an alum of Georgian Court, but of St. Joseph's College in Maine. And the Mercy charism values permeated there as it permeates at Georgian Court. I have spent most of my ministerial life as a member of the Sisters of Mercy in higher education. And I have seen through generations of graduates how their lives have been shaped and how they have been committed not only to their professional endeavors, but also a commitment to giving back to community, engagement in justice, as well as leading very wonderful personal lives. So there is a real sense for me about Georgian Court as this wonderful Mercy University positioning itself to face the future and the challenges which continually unfold before us in a very deep value system that really continues to energize me. And therefore, felt it was really a privilege, blessing to be asked to serve on this board. And I will just say that I was involved in the Mercy Higher Education Colloquium organization, which was the precursor for the conference,
Right.
and to meet and to be aware of many of the sisters who are no longer associated And spending time at Georgian Court has always had a wonderful place in my heart, actually. So thank you for the opportunity, even though I did not raise my hand.
Jim Dickerson, you said you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
Please go.
I came to Georgian Court. I had been on the board of trustees at Ryder for 10 years and had to cycle off of there. And I was off of it about 2 years. And four of my best friends, John Seasold, who's retiring today, Gene Serpentelli, who retired a couple months ago, Mark Ricca, who he's retired like I am mentally, but he's on. And then Peter Stroh, my dear friend who died 2 years ago. They came to me almost as a group. And they said, Jim, we have serious financial issues. And we know you've dealt with them at Ryder. We know you've dealt with them in your career. Would you be willing to come on the board and help out? And I said, sure, I'll be, and I grew up in Lakewood. Two of my mother's best friends were Sisters of Mercy who were resident in Georgian Court. So I agreed to come to Georgian Court, figuring I could help out a little bit, but I never realized that dealing with finance in a university that's all business and accounting people like Ryder is a lot different than dealing with finance in a university, which is all Sisters and Mercy and Mission. So it has been an interesting time, but I think we've come to a wonderful place, and I'm hopeful to help go forward with what we now have in front of us.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. And Joe, I think I hope that you're having the experience that I've had when I've done this exercise with my own trustees. You're a fortunate man as president. And I guess what I would say to all of you as trustees is reflect periodically on why you've joined the board. But I think it was Frank Coleman who specifically talked about why he stayed. And I suspect, particularly for those of you who are not alums, I was thinking during your conversation of the most prominent member of the Jewish community in Reading, who was my first board chair. And he joined the board because he was community minded and was asked to do it. But the reason he stayed on the board for 3 terms was the mission and the relationship with the Franciscan sisters. And finally, the fact that although he had gone to an elite school, he loved the fact that our school was giving opportunity to first-generation students and other underrepresented groups, something that you have very much at the heart of your mission. So keep a hold of what energizes you as trustees. We can go to the next slide, Stephanie, and we'll start talking about expectations and responsibilities. Go back. We need to go backwards a couple of slides. Yes, and you can stay right there. One of the things that I want to do is just say very briefly to you, the foundation of a high-performing board is the partnership that the board builds with the president. And the foundation of the board's partnership with the president is based in mutual expectations. So we'll take this slide down in a minute, and I'm going to ask you, maybe 5 or 6 of you on each of these topics, what are some of your major expectations of your president? And please, like to hear from new trustees as well as veterans. And then we will turn to the second one. What do you think the president's major expectations are of you? And then I will do a little bit of conclusion on this. So we'll start with your expectations of the president, and then we'll flip it and ask what you assume the president's expectations are of you. So Stephanie, we can go back to seeing all the faces.
Yeah.
So who wants to start?
This is
Bob Hutchins.
Sure. My expectations of our relationship with the President, Joe, is that he be a long-term visionary, someone who provides us with a long-term vision of the future of both the educational world, higher education, as well as Georgian Court University's place in that vision with respect to community that we serve and the students that we serve. So I look to Joe for vision, academic vision. That's my expectation.
Good. Bob Mulcahy?
Tom, I think it's important that we start with a basic understanding of what the board's role is with the president. And it starts with the fact that the board is not the CEO. The president is the CEO. It's the board's responsibility to set policy, provide guidance and support. And for the chair of the board to represent the board in creating the relationship with the president that can create the kind of bond and trust that's important. And it's that relationship that then translates to the board and its committees that I think are critical to understanding the board's role as opposed to other things. And I think once everybody understands that and functions through the committee process and upward, I think that's a basic understanding of where we are as a board in relationship to the president.
Good, thank you. Frank Coleman?
I think probably the single biggest expectation I would have would be that, and this speaks generally, not specifically, that the president understands his role as leadership versus manager, that and understands the strengths that he as a leader has and the weaknesses that he or she as a leader has, and builds around them the elements to maximize the strength and improve the weaknesses. And out of that, uses those building blocks to allow that person, he or she, to lead and not necessarily have to manage. The ultimate president will be someone who leads the institution forward and has managers around that are dealing with the day-to-day in excellent style.
Yeah, that's a superb comment. Going to Joyce next, and then over to Chris.
One thing I think about for a president is really walking that delicate balance between transformation and preservation. You need to move the organization forward, but yet you need to know what you need to preserve and protect with the organization and manage that change through the multiple stakeholders. And it's everyone from current students to alumni, to faculty, to the local community, to your financial community. So it's a delicate balance, and I look for a president to manage that. Manage through that balance with seeking advice from the board.
Yeah, that's a superb. I'm working right now with 3 brand new presidents, sort of in a coaching capacity, and that's a wonderful statement of some of what I've been talking to them about. They need to be change agents, but they also need to be very sensitive to what is in the culture that they need to preserve, and it's probably good coaching advice even for veteran presidents. So thank you for that. And speaking of veteran presidents, Chris.
Yeah, as a president and as a trustee, I look at a president's role as almost a bridge, someone who connects the university community to the trustees, both in terms of vision and leadership. And I think that high functioning boards are boards that really support the visionary direction of a president. And I think the two of those moving together in a good way makes for a great university. So and my experience with Joe and with Bob and your leadership, having served as the facilitator who performed your last accreditation, I was so impressed with the leadership of this university. And I think Joe really does serve as a bridge for the university community and the trustees. And I believe the trustees are very supportive of the efforts, the visionary efforts of Joe and his team and all that you're doing here. So it's a great example, I think, of presidential leadership right here at Georgian Court.
Good. One or two more comments about the board's expectations of the president. Jim Andrews and then Julia.
Yeah, as in any organization, I believe that communication is a key. And as I heard earlier, as we began today, and we talked about selling 7 acres for $44 million, and the numbers sound great, but I'm just wondering what did it take away from the university? So at some point, it will be good to understand some of the major decisions are being made. So as a trustee, we'll feel, even though we may not have made that decision to sell the acreage, I'm sure it was necessary, but it's good to understand what the major decisions are. So clear communications back and forth, I think is critical.
Julia?
I just want to respond to James briefly, and that is it's 36 acres and it's uninhabited. It's trees. It's an edge of the campus we don't use. So I come from 40 years in higher education. So I have had some experience of presidents, and I came on the board with Joe. And in those 6 years, I've seen him exhibit a lot of the things that I would see as an expectations of the president. To be a learner, a lifelong learner, and to learn on the job, about the job, self-improvement, and to continue to evolve as a learner in his own particular discipline. And I guess Chris used the term bridge. I like maybe a relationship builder, not a architectural builder, to build relationships with the board, with the Sisters of Mercy, with the students, the local community, the higher ed community. And I've seen Joe gradually do all of those things. And also to learn about the Sisters of Mercy, the foundation, the critical concerns. I see all of that blossomed in 6 years.
So let me flip things. And I know there's a few people on the phone. And since I can't see your hands, either put your hand up in chat or just speak up if you want to be in on the conversation. So let's flip things and ask all of you trustees to put yourself in Joe's shoes. And what do you think are the most important expectations that your president would have of you as the board? Bob Mulcahy got us started by talking, in terms of the partnership both ways and the board respecting Joe as the CEO, not as a board member. So that sort of was a good foundational step. Alicia, we'll start with you.
I think transparency, ethical advisement and guidance, commitment to actually participating on the board, adhering to the confidentiality policy, and understanding that we are a fiduciary, understanding that we have a fiduciary responsibility to the university.
Yeah, and I would just call out the first word you used, because board members certainly expect their president to be transparent, but that's a very important expectation that presidents have of boards, that you be transparent in the ways that are appropriate. Others, Ed Smith?
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about a board and board members, we talk a lot about skill sets. But my perspective, and I've over time done a fair amount of consulting or for-profit boards, public companies. One of the things is availability. It doesn't matter how good the skill set of anybody who's a director or a trustee of any organization, how good their skill sets are makes absolutely no difference unless they're available to serve and available to reach out and help the president or help the board. I think that's, the greatest thing somebody has to kind of sign up mentally to do. That if you're going to join a board, you've got to be willing to spend the time and go to the meetings and be engaged.
Good, thank you. Tammy?
Sister Julia had mentioned the idea of the president being a relationship builder. And I was thinking that one of the roles as a trustee is facilitating some of that relationship building. We all come from diverse backgrounds, companies, organizations. universities even. And we all have these social networks that supply resources, whether it's information, connections to other people, or people who have the skills that we don't have. And so we can help facilitate building those relationships and pulling those resources into Georgian Court University as well.
I don't know whether Joe and Matt use this phrase, but certainly the phrase that I've always used is friend raising. Occasionally a trustee will actually do fundraising, but many trustees are not comfortable doing that. But all trustees need to be friend raisers. And that's a whole interesting topic in itself. But Tammy, I think you gave us a great overview of the various ways that trustees can build relationships and friend raise. And I would say to you that there's no more effective way to connect someone new to Georgian Court than to have a trustee do it. With all due respect to us presidents, when a trustee connects someone in, that has a power to it. Frank Coleman?
Oh, I think support. The president should expect that the board will support that vision. Support doesn't necessarily mean everything falls the way of the president, but support the fact that he or she is responsible for, moving it forward, for shaping it, and we're going to commit everything we have to realizing it. And I think the second is that, especially for those of us that don't come from a higher ed background, that we reflect our advice from the context of the higher ed background. We try ourselves to translate whatever advice we're giving within the context of a higher ed background, which might be different than the natural context from which we live and breathe every day. I think that's an important expectation the president would have of us as board members.
Yeah, that's a wonderful comment. I am, to my amazement, suddenly after 5 years on the board, I'm chairing the board of one of the two national drug and alcohol treatment centers. And I knew nothing about the treatment industry. I was recruited to the board because of my governance background, because I knew the chief executive. And I will tell you that 5 or 6 years in, at my age, it has been extraordinarily exciting to learn a whole new sector of society. And so one of the value adds for you as trustees that you have a right to expect is the learning that you do, particularly if you come from outside of higher ed. And even those of you, and there's a couple of you on the board, which is always very important, who have higher ed backgrounds, there's still plenty of learning for you as well. But it's a great privilege for a trustee to come onto a board in a sector that they're not familiar with and do that kind of learning. Any one or two final comments on the president's expectations of the board? Anything else that anyone wants to add? You catch everybody? Bess, please. Bess and then John Shea. There's a hand up. Oh, you're okay, Bess.
It wasn't my hand, but I'll comment a couple of things because I was Michelle or somebody earlier on.
Okay.
So, I think that that the president does expect support from the board, and I think that my experience on the board has been that the board has always supported the president, whether it was Sister Rosemary in the beginning for me or for Joe. And I think that the board, the selection of the trustees is so amazing here at Georgian Court that the discussions at meetings have been able to be supportive on both ends, that Joe gets the support and that we get the support, and we can speak from our various backgrounds and respect one another and come out with a decision which makes everybody feel good. So I think that we have had amazing boards here, and we've had two amazing presidents in my experience. And where my hand was up in the very beginning was speaking from the alumni, and something that was said earlier about those of us who are, I think maybe Joyce said it, but and Jeff said it, is that the history that we can contribute as alumni and the culture is important for those who are not alums to know and to respect as we go forward. So it's been a great privilege for me.
Good. John?
Yes, the concept that I was most surprised to learn about was shared governance. Understanding the role of faculty, the president, and the board is so different from the corporate experience that I spent the rest of my life. And I think the president must expect the board to learn about joint shared governance with the faculty and himself.
Good, thank you. Any final comment from anyone? Okay, we can go back to the next slide, Stephanie, which is the first, it's slide 6. Good, that's great. So folks, one of the things that both your board chair and your president asked me to do at some point during the day together is go over some basics of board responsibility and expectations. And one of the reasons I wanted to have the conversation we just had before I go through my slides was so that you would already have begun to think about this, and as you will see, think about a great many of the things that are on them. So what I'm going to do on these next couple of slides is talk about a couple of these topics, not every single one of them. Certainly the first one is self-explanatory. I forget who it was, but one of you, I think it was the first person who spoke, talked about the fact that his major expectation of Joe was around vision, and I heard him say particularly long-term vision. And I would say that framing the big strategic issues, what the questions are, what the challenges are, you will bring in people, occasionally someone like myself, to talk about external trends, but as trustees, you have an opportunity to contribute on external trends, particularly trends that are going to impact your university. And it's a president's responsibility to be thinking about them. I would say that although trustees at Georgian Court need to keep their eyes on the present, and yes, you have an important monitoring function, remember that your president, and especially your vice presidents, spend a lot of time focused on the present. And if there's one thing that presidents really need from trustees is thinking about strategy, is thinking about the future, is thinking about the big challenges down the road. A colleague and I did a number of mini retreats for AGB presidents and board chairs during the pandemic. And one of the things that was very clear as we get towards the end of what we hope is the end of the pandemic is that boards need to be thinking beyond fiscal year 2023. The next year or two is one thing, but we need to be thinking far beyond that. One of you talked about relationship building. I think two of you did. I would say that for trustees who come from outside of higher ed, probably the most underestimated part of the presidential role is understanding the diverse relationships and constituencies. Chris and Joe and I, unfortunately, have friends who had really good metrics as presidents, and the board had to let them go because they did not do well with relationship building. And while the faculty relationship is the one that always makes the press, in one case, I have a good friend who had extraordinary metrics, and the board let him go because he wasn't effective working with the board. And the board decided that metrics weren't enough. So the relationships are very, very important, well beyond the faculty. And those of you who come from the business world where you have a group of board members that's 8 or 10, the private ed boards like Georgian Court tend to be someplace between the high 20s and the low 30s. And those are a lot of relationships that are very important. One of you talked about transparency, and I would say a big expectation of the president is to foster candor and collegiality. certainly on the campus, but also among the board. There's always a great joke that presidents hear where there's always someone saying that faculty morale has never been any lower than last year or the year before that. But the morale on campus and the spirit on campus is something that the president needs to have some responsibility for. And a lot of this has to do with the presidential style and how open the president is about challenges and how open the president is with his or her board and how open the board is about disagreement and about things that maybe aren't 100% everyone on the same page. We can go to the next slide, Stephanie. You obviously know you have a fiduciary duty of monitoring. And frankly, those of you who are long-term trustees probably have seen some of this shift. It used to be that most boards focused almost entirely on monitoring. And now we know boards have other responsibilities. I would just say that the board's effectiveness in monitoring depends a lot on how the president provides the right information, the right amount of information, the right format of information, and the right timing of information. I have some horror stories from my own 2 presidencies where I didn't monitor sufficiently the way in which vice presidents were staffing board committees, and they were providing material to the trustees that was either way too down in the weeds or way too much information or information at the last minute. So the right information, the right amount of information, the right format, the right timing, very, very important. We're going to talk more at the end of the session about trustee talent, but I would just say that that's a major responsibility of the president in partnership with the board chair and maybe the governance chair is leveraging trustee talent. We talked about the fundraising and friend raising. In the case of places like Georgian Court, trustees set an example for the community in their own philanthropic leadership. And then this next thing about monitoring and coordinating staff support of the board, I was fortunate to lead a board that had very, very high satisfaction with the way the board functioned and the way the board meetings ran until we assessed the committees. And we discovered that the committees were being staffed in a fairly uneven manner by my vice presidents. And one of the things that I didn't do sufficiently well was help vice presidents learn as to how to staff a committee, making sure that it's led by the trustees and make sure that trustee dialogue rather than reports are the most important thing. And obviously all boards expect presidents not to surprise them. So we can go to the next slide if we could, Stephanie. As far as the president's expectations of you all as trustees, certainly a big one is that you maintain and support a collective agenda within the board and with the president. And I think a lot of you who have board experience know that that does not mean that there's not active debate and dialogue and sometimes disagreement during the board meeting. But once decisions are made, there's a real focus on a collective agenda. I like to think of you as having a threefold focus, certainly monitoring, but also a focus on strategy and a focus on, I'm calling it advocacy. One of your trustee colleagues called it relationship building or connecting your president with the outside. And then having a balanced perspective, both the external environment, but also being sensitive to what is going on at Georgian Court and obviously long and short term. I think this next one is one that a couple of you addressed very well. Your ability to contribute on the board depends so much on the thoroughness of your preparation. And this last bullet is one that I think is particularly important. And several of you gave wonderful examples of this when I asked you at the beginning why you were on the Georgian Court board. It's very important that those of you who bring expertise that's particularly important for Georgian Court at this time contribute that expertise. And yet, both for your own value add, your own enjoyment, but also for the quality of the board, it's very important that you learn to work outside your comfort zone on the board. One of the things that I did at Alvernia was every new trustee was put on a committee where he or she had, if not expertise, at least a real comfort level in terms of their contribution. And then we always put that trustee on a second committee in which they knew very, very little. I was put on the treatment committee when I joined the board of alcohol and drug treatment, and I knew nothing about treatment. And we can make very valuable contributions in situations where we know very little by asking some good questions. One of your members, it might have been Alicia, I'm not sure, talked about the importance of having some respect for the academic culture. And I would say that respect for the academic culture is essential for a trustee, but it's not sufficient. If all you do is respect it and you never challenge it, that won't be really helpful for your president or for your institution. And being a constructive skeptic at times, asking questions. One of you mentioned shared governance, requiring that the president and the senior team educate you on some of the things about higher education are very, very important. And finally, a last slide on this topic, Stephanie. The second bullet there, I would just remind you all, and I'm using community in the broadest possible sense. There's some of you who obviously have significant political background with public policy. Some of you are active in Catholic ministries. Some of you are in higher ed. Some of you are Mercy Sisters. Providing that touch with the outside world, and particularly your external perspective. You know, most of you are going to have attended college. You may be parents and so forth. But the fact simply that you've been a parent or you've been a student is not necessarily your most important perspective. It's the perspective of the work and the world in which you live, and your ability to bring that very helpfully to the institution. One of you talked about mutual transparency and upholding confidentiality. That's very, very important. And let me just spend a little bit of time on that, on the last one. And I was so pleased that several of you used the word support. And one of you made clear that support doesn't mean you agree with everything or you don't question everything. But very, very important that you have support and care for the president. That's a primary responsibility for your board chair and board officers, but one for all of you as well. Regardless of what the personality is, it's a rare president who's not something of a type A plus. Even if they appear to be low key, they really are pretty hard charging. And even though presidents have a responsibility to self-manage, it's very, very important that you pay attention to the president as well. When presidents have young children at home or young children in high school, boards tend to be very, very proactive in making sure that the president has family time very much prioritized. But when a president is single, a member of a religious community, for instance, or if the president's kids are gone and off in college or in adulthood, it's very important that the board find ways to support the president. And of course, that's best done by talking to the president about this, because we all sort of will respond in different ways. I had a board chair that lived in New York City. He ran Hearst newspapers back in the day when that was a big deal, and with lots of lawsuits. And we used to meet every 2 weeks over the phone at 7:15 in the morning. And on mornings where we didn't have a lot of agenda, he would ask me just sort of how it's going and how it was feeling. And it was a very helpful reminder for me to sort of get away from all the goals and tasks and spend some time just talking about the presidency itself. We're going to go to one last slide like this and then conclude by talking about board and trustee responsibilities. And this is a slide that I will spend more time on. We can go to slide 10, I believe it is, Stephanie. This is a slide that for the new trustees, we will spend a fair amount of time on at trustee orientation in the fall. I just wanted to put it up there for the full board. In the interest of time, we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on this. Hopefully, if you listen to Dennis Holzschneider's video, you got a little bit of a sense of this. what I would say to you are gone are the days in which the board's fiduciary responsibility was primarily around finances. That certainly is still an important responsibility. But as you heard from Dennis very clearly, your two major responsibilities are around mission and quality. And quality is the quality of the education at Georgian Court, but also the quality of the experience. And think of how many of the alumni on the board talked about their experience. They didn't make short shrift about the quality of the academics, but they talked about their experience. And your fiduciary responsibility is really around mission and around quality, and also, of course, around finances. Boards have far higher expectations around transparency than ever before. And transparency is about accountability. It's about a degree of candor. It's also about the kinds of things that the board chair and the president put on the agenda and how they put them on. There are boards still today in which the president's report at a board meeting is primarily a cheerleading section. And one of my senior trustees really pushed me that the last 5 to 7 years of my presidency, one of the things that was required at every board meeting was that I had to say what was keeping me up at night. And there was always a nice joke around that, because I told him that after 15 to 20 years as a president, the only thing that kept me awake at night were personnel issues. All of the other things I managed to sleep pretty well, but the personnel issues would keep me up. But it was a way of forcing me and forcing the board to be looking at what's problematic and what are the areas where the president could potentially get help from. Far greater responsibilities now the board has for strategy, the kinds of activities that you were talking about at the beginning of the board, at the beginning of this call, about the land and so forth. Those kinds of strategy decisions, very important. The board is very much in the middle of that. These last three could take a great deal of time. I'll just say a quick word about them, and then I'm going to stop and ask if there's any questions or comments. You read the newspapers, and the big increase in trustee activism is both good news and bad news. There's an enormous increase in what I would call intellectual activism, and I mean that in a very positive sense. Trustees seeing themselves as thought partners with the president, as having a responsibility to be thinking about external trends, to be thinking out into the future. What are some of the kinds of issues we should be thinking about? When I signed my last contract at Alvernia, I wasn't prepared for it, but a trustee said, "What do you need from us?" And I have no idea where this came from. I had never thought of it. I said, "I need for you not to become intellectually lazy during my last several years." I will say this knowing that Joe is an effective president and that you have strong support for him. But the stronger your support becomes for your president, and the longer your president stays, the more your president needs and deserves your intellectual activism, your challenging questions, your good thinking. Behavioral activism, on the other hand, rogue trustees who are running to vice presidents, who are dominating meetings, those are obviously things that you read about in the press. They tend to be more common in the public sector because trustees there are appointed. They're not screened by the trusteeship governance committee itself. And these last two things, sadly, there's an enormous increase. This predates COVID, by the way, with faculty feeling increasingly marginalized. Part of that is that Georgian Court and Alvernia are not typical of higher education. In much of higher education, there's been a significant decline in the number of full-time faculty in the classroom. There's often a decline in the number of faculty who are on tenure track. And so faculty have become increasingly concerned about the fact that they are less important in the institution. Shared governance is a topic we will spend some time on at new trustee orientation. And this is a topic that at the AGB Institute, which Bob and Joe attended, we spend a fair amount of time on this. I would just say that in terms of shared governance, you ought to remember that there is three parts of governance. There's your own board governance, which you attend to through your governance committee and your own good work. There's faculty governance, and then there's university governance. University governance cannot function effectively unless the board governance and faculty governance are both functioning effectively. You don't have direct responsibility for faculty governance, but you are obviously making sure that Joe is paying attention to that in partnership with his chief academic officer, and you have oversight responsibility for university governance. Shared governance tended to mean, until the last 10 years or so, that the faculty took care of this and the board took care of this. Increasingly, shared governance is about sharing, that the board is involved in program development, though the board doesn't have the primary responsibility there. The faculty are involved in talking about finances, though they don't have the primary responsibility there. So we're seeing some models of shared governance that are very exciting. And actually, there are a number of schools during the pandemic that have had big increases in faculty and board satisfaction with shared governance. Although, as you probably have read, there are a lot of places in which shared governance has been under attack. So let's go to our full screen for just a quick second, Stephanie, before we do our last part. Any comments or questions on what we've just covered that anyone wants to raise?
Yeah, I would like. I'd like.
Yeah, please, Jim Dickerson.
I know that in your discussion, you said that, oh, the importance of the board used to be finance, and now it's not important, but other things are more important.
Or equally, yeah.
Or yeah. Unfortunately, if you don't have a financial infrastructure that is functioning, it doesn't matter how good your mission, how good your education, how good everything else, you're not going to make it. When I came to the board, I would say out of 30 board members, there were less than 10 who had any idea about the financial situation the university was in. The reality was, out of 11 prior years, the university has never made money, only one out of 11 years. And it was losing $2 to $3 to $4 million a year. And I used to quote my former president at another university and say, we're not in the business for profit, but we're certainly not in the business for a loss. And we need to do something, or else we won't be here. So it doesn't matter how good our mission is or our vision or the future. We have to have an infrastructure that will support a mission and a vision and everything else. And it's taken a while, and I'd say now of the total board, I'd say we're probably 2/3 of them really understand where our finances are. And that's only because I've been hammering on it for the last 7 years. And we happen to be at a point, we were at a point in the last 3 years that if something major didn't happen, we were going to have to figure out how to, I'll say it, shut down the ranch. We couldn't continue to go on. If we'd have been a business, we would have had what was called a going concern opinion in our audit, because we had not made any money. We were just spending money. We now are at the point where we've had a breakthrough. And as a result of that breakthrough, we've been given a new life. We'll put a new financial structure underneath us, and we'll deal with the things that are important. But we can't forget that you've got to keep your eye on running the ship if you want the ship to get anywhere.
Bob Mulcahy?
Jim and I have really worked hard on that, and I appreciate what he's done. I just want to add a couple thoughts. The issue of shared governance is something that may be new to most of the trustees, but we have taken some steps in the past year, and Joe can certainly comment on this, but we now have the faculty representatives sit in the board meetings. We've created an advisory financial committee with the faculty so that they would get to understand what the finances were. And I have to say that this faculty has not marginalized itself. It's helped us. They were willing to forsake contributions to their TIA CREF, to do furloughs and to do things that needed to work, they worked with us. And I think it's important that we've continued to maintain that kind of faculty relationship, because when we've needed to find ways to help one another, we've been there, which is why we did some of the things in the budget this year to increase things that we've done. Joe, you want to comment on that a little bit, because you understand the shared governance well?
Sure, and there's been a strong tradition even before I got here of shared governance. Faculty members serve on many of the board committees in an advisory role, so they do see a lot of what's going on, and they get the interaction with board members. And we've had a longstanding tradition of an annual dinner with the board, and we invite all the faculty. We only have about 100 faculty members, so we're able to invite everybody, and about 30 actually show up, and they've been really good discussions, and it's a way of board members getting to interact with faculty members. And it's something that I have never seen at any other institution that I've served in, where you have that kind of socialization going on. And we've been trying, as Bob indicated, in the last year or so, to continue to promote faculty governance. The Budget Advisory Committee is one of those that we just created this year, including the leader of the faculty in the full board meetings now. Again, continues to lead to that transparency. It goes back to what you were saying, Tom. Transparency, not only between the president and the board, the president, and the rest of the university community as well, is very important.
Well, Bob and Joe, I'm so glad you said what you did. I was going to call on you. I deliberately didn't use the examples, but for the benefit of the rest of the board, I would tell you that several of the things that you have in place would probably come under that lovely familiar phrase of best practice. While it is not best practice to have a faculty member as a voting member of the board, it is a best practice to have the president of the faculty or the leader of the faculty be an observer at the board meeting, to have faculty on board committees, and the finance committee that Bob and Joe both alluded to. That's probably the best example I know of initiatives that got taken during the pandemic. And one reason why you got the kind of support you got for some of the difficult decisions was because of how the process was handled. Those of you who have background in higher ed know that very often the disagreement on campus is not about the decision or the result, it's about the process. And one of the things that you have attended to very well. So my observation, just based on primarily a conversation with Joe about this, is that you have some very, very good things in place, and obviously building on a good culture there. Other comments? Before we move back to board responsibility, just one thing I would say back to Jim Dickerson's comments. You know what, I would say that there's two points he made. It's very important that there be a number of people on the board who have expertise in finance, but it's equally important that all board members are thoroughly aware of the financial situation, both the pros and the cons. And that's a responsibility of both senior management and board leadership to make sure that that kind of information is well understood. Chris Domes, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I would just comment, it's really intentional connections between faculty and trustees. I think I would echo Tom, your comment about best practices. It's great that you've been able to bring the faculty into conversations about decision making and having them be partners in that process. That's really important. I also say, just from visiting your campus and spending some days on your campus, I've heard this said. Doug Orr, who's a friend of mine and a friend of Tom's, that he's mentioned to me a number of times in conversations about the importance of socialization. Really building a social framework and network among trustees, but also inviting others into that social experience. The best way to work with each other is to know each other. And it's hard to know one another if you're only meeting, because if you're only meet, you're hearing presentations. Some people don't get to talk. You don't get to know one another. That socialization, I think, is a really important piece of creating great boards and great relationship. And the Mercy mission is about, and Catholic mission, higher education is about relationship building, and that's an important piece of what we do. So I just want to comment on those things.
Good, well said. Patricia, are you putting your hand up?
Yes, I was. And I wanted to just pick up on what Chris said, because this is a conversation the board has had before. I believe that at a Mercy Catholic institution, what we really work for is not simply socialization, but what I would call a sacramental presence. And by that, I do not mean necessarily having Eucharist, although we do that, but the gathering at meals and the conversation is part of an understanding that this is a holy place, and that the work that we do together is not simply business, but it's building up a community of responsible people around a community of learning. That's part of the Catholic culture, and we can't lose that.
Yeah, well said. I mean, if there's no mission, if there's no margin, but on the other hand, if you have a margin and you haven't paid attention to your mission, it's equally a problem. So well said. Back Bob Mulcahy again.
Yeah, Tom, I just wanted to add before we go to break. When I went to the board chair president with Joe and talked to other chairs, the one thing that struck us was the way they ran their committee meetings the day before their board meetings. So we came home and we instituted that. Now we've had to do it by Zoom, but part of the process is that we have the committee meetings on Thursday afternoon. We have mass and we have dinner in the mansion, so that the next morning we have the board meeting, and at lunchtime we're done. So it was a sense of that socialization that we got there. And I think it's from everything we've heard back, it's worked. Now this year we couldn't have the dinners because of the pandemic, but in the past the dinners have always been very helpful, and I think people enjoyed it. And we even have something that nobody expects. Jim Dickerson plays the piano well. So despite all of his concerns about being tough on finances, when it comes to the piano, he's pretty damn good at it.
Good, thank you. Do you want to take a 5-minute break now, or do you want to do this last little section before we break? Bob?
Let's do the last little session
Okay.
and then the break.
So let's go back to the next slide, Stephanie, board responsibilities, which is slide 11. I'm going to cover these two slides very quickly, and then give you a final discussion question. Those of you who have worked with AGB, or if you read Trusteeship Magazine, AGB will generally give you a list of about 15 or 20 responsibilities that you have. I don't want to make light of that long list, but I also think that if you have 15 or 20 responsibilities, it's hard to know which the ones are most important. So this is my own little way of grouping board responsibilities. Mission and strategy, and notice that I put those two together. And yes, I assume strategy assumes financial strategy, but mission and strategy, major responsibility for the board. We talked about monitoring and oversight, and important that that's focused on the right issues in the right way. Philanthropy and advocacy, I put together. And both of those, you often hear give, get, or help in some other way, but very important, the friend-raising conversation we had before. Governance and succession planning is something that in the small private sector, the regional university sector, which Georgian Court is in, 10 or 15 years ago, there was a trusteeship committee which recruited trustees, but there wasn't a focus on governance. And we talked about governance before as the board governance, university governance, and not your direct responsibility, but responsibility that you monitor with Joe on faculty governance. Succession planning is something that our schools are paying far, far more attention to. That's succession planning in terms of board leadership. And don't make the mistake that so many boards do, which is that the only thing they talk about is who's going to be the next board chair. Succession planning is more broadly leadership within the board. There's a lot of different ways to lead within the board, grooming people to become committee chairs, task forces, and so forth. Obviously, presidential succession planning, and you don't have direct responsibility for succession planning below Joe, but Joe has responsibility for succession planning, as any president does, and that's an important thing for your executive comp or executive committee to review with him periodically. We could spend an entire couple of hours on the whole topic of presidential evaluation. I will just say to you very quickly that it needs to be rigorous, and it needs to be rigorous even when you have a highly successful president. It needs to be looking at metrics and concrete results. It needs to be looking at relationships. And obviously, presidential evaluation is a time for you to give both very, very strong support and also advice. And last but not least, trustee expectations. Hopefully you have heard some version of this. The next slide, please, Stephanie. Hopefully you know about the secular trinity of time, talent, and treasure, or the one that I heard for the first time a couple of years ago, and I think I like even better, work, wisdom, wealth, and wit, since we certainly need those. I'm going to say that for the most part, I think presidents and board leaders do a good job in emphasizing the effective use of trustee time, and that's obviously important in terms of trustee preparation. And trustee treasure and philanthropy varies so much from every institution. So we can go to the next slide, Stephanie. I'd like to conclude before we take a break, maybe for the next 7 or 8 minutes until high noon. Let me ask each of you to think about this and hear maybe some of you talk about this. In what ways could I enhance my contribution of talent to the board? I'm not talking about your time. I'm not talking about philanthropy. And you might be thinking of their enhance. Father Dennis made the great comment that although you have some responsibility to be stewards to preserve, that if trustees only preserve, they're not doing their fiduciary responsibility. You need to be building, you need to be enhancing. So as you think about talent, you think about talent very broadly, and Stephanie, we can go back now to the full screen of everybody. Let me ask some of you to maybe reflect out loud as to how you think you could enhance your talent. And feel free to define talent in many, many different ways. And this calls for probably less humility than usual. So be thinking about how you can enhance your talent contribution to the board.
Well, Tom, I can just tell you what I told Joe and what I told Bob when I said yes to being on the board. I as a 36-year veteran of Catholic higher education, and my first time as a trustee on any board of trustees, my goal is to help support and to bring whatever wisdom and knowledge I've learned over those years to help Georgian Court. I have a lot of respect for this university and for Joe and Bob's leadership and for the work of the trustees. So I just want to be helpful and provide as much support and guidance and wisdom out of the field of higher ed and out of the leadership roles I've played in higher education to help strengthen the university.
Thanks, Chris. Joyce?
Yeah, one of the things that I think about is being the lifelong learner. So what really resonated with me during the conversation is, each of us have a skill set and talents that we bring, but I think it's that being a learner and willingness to learn outside of your area of expertise. Sometimes the best ideas come from people who aren't immersed in the discipline. And I think
Yes.
as being, for myself, I think about that being willing to and signing up for it, even though it may be hard at times, but knowing that that will enhance the talent and my own personal talent and what I can be able to contribute.
My experience is that some of my most valuable trustees over the years were the ones who had the least familiarity with higher ed when they came in. And one of you talked very wonderfully in the opening segment about applying your talent from or expertise from outside to inside. I think that's a really, really important observation. Who's next? Jim Andrews?
Yeah, I guess we took pause and raised our hand on answering this one because I guess we need to really understand where the needs are. I'm not sure, is there a need to increase the student body population? And if so, do you bring potential students in and is there an opportunity for us to, as trustees, to talk about students and tell them why selecting Georgian Court might be a great selection if they're looking at 2 or 3 different universities. I wanted to mention, I did have an opportunity to attend at least 3 or 4 different AGB conferences. It was for foundations with $50 million or less. And I'm sure you're familiar, then the following week for foundations, 100 million or more. And the best practices and the things I learned from other attendees was a great value to take back to the university I was working with at that time. But in summary, I guess it's once I understand where the need is, I would hope to be able to contribute. So.
Yeah, and Jim, that's a wonderful comment and was one of the things I was going to say at the end. Joe and Bob have a primary responsibility to reach out to all of you and leverage your talent, but it's also a trustee responsibility to step forward and asking where I am needed and where I could be helpful is a wonderful approach. I'm going to go to Alicia and then Patricia.
Thank you. I'm a communications professional who's always growing and adapting because I need to. I've earned a reputation, I think, for being a top communicator. I turn down contract work at this point because I'm just at capacity. I love writing and editing and proofreading, and it comes quite natural to me. We're in a world now. I want to go back to the last speaker that talked about, like, what does the college need? What are the needs? Some of them are implicit needs and not that obvious. So we're in a world now where silence often means being complicit, where inaction is called out more than action is. I have my pulse on optics and how things would potentially play out publicly. A big chunk of my job is crisis communication and protecting the brand reputation and drafting statements on some horrific events we've seen over the last 2 years. And we want confidentiality, but we don't always have it. I live my professional life through the lens of if it's in writing, it can leak. So my guiding, I've seen, I mean, my current job is a highly visible role, and things are leaking constantly from our board. So my guiding principle is if anything you're writing, if you're okay with it showing up in the New York Times tomorrow as is, then send it. If not, send it to me and let me look over it first. So for example, my job now is often in the Times, NPR, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, for better or for worse, usually for worse. And so when I'm ghostwriting statements or speeches, I explain to the speaker why I maybe changed certain words that seemed insignificant to them. And then the speaker learns the why behind my communications choice. For example, just yesterday, I had to change the word stupid out, and I swapped it with something like foolish or silly. I changed the word crippling or paralyzing to the word devastating, because the earlier word choices are now viewed as albiest. And I use words that are now, pronoun, not pronoun specific. Those are just a few examples. And small changes can mean all the difference in the public sphere, and having someone on the team that does this quite naturally, I think, is a benefit. And I hope to bring that to this board.
Good, thank you. Thank you. it's very unusual in my experience to have someone on the board who actually has expertise in crisis communication, and that's invaluable. Patricia?
As a sister of mercy, when I came on this board, I serve on several other boards as well, but I was so conscious of the fact of the challenges facing the university and of the fact that I don't really have any money to give. However, I really believe that my ministerial experience, both in the academic realm, but then more practically in the realm of healthcare administration, is something that has really helped me to be able to contribute to the university, and something I want to continue to do into the future, even after my term ends.
Good, thank you. Any final contribution anyone wants to make? So let me encourage you to think about that. And one of the things I would just remind you, several of you talked about having other board experience. That's a very, very valuable resource for Joe and Bob to draw on. If you have experience with strategy broadly, with change management, which is going to be something that will be a major thing in the coming years, regardless of what else is on the table. Bob and Joe, should we take a 5-minute break, a 10-minute break? What's your pleasure here? So for this second session, we're going to focus specifically on the second half of what Joe mentioned in his opening comment, governing particularly for mission and Catholic higher education, and then specifically at a Mercy school. So we can go to the next slide, Stephanie. I thought, folks, I would just give you, and I'm not going to say much about this, but I just thought I'd give you a little bit of overview in terms of some quick facts. About 220 Catholic colleges and universities. This may or may not surprise you, but notice that the overwhelming percentage of them, over 200, are founded by religious orders, about equally distributed. And I thought you'd be interested to know, the Mercies have 17 schools concentrated in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And there are 3 other orders, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, that have large numbers. And then you might be interested to know there are 25 schools that are the only schools sponsored by their religious order. Next slide. So there are a little under 900,000 students at Catholic colleges and universities. That's not the number of Catholic students, that's the total student population. And although you certainly know about Georgetown and Notre Dame and Boston College, notice that the median enrollment is 2,600. And then the percentages that are in parentheses are sort of what would be the national norm, and the ones not in parentheses are at Catholic schools. So Catholic colleges and universities are slightly more female. Notice, not surprisingly, that at Catholic universities, Catholic students are less than 50%. And I think I think a lot of people tend to assume that most Catholic schools are educating overwhelmingly Catholic students. That is not the case. Notice that the white population is almost the same. We have much lower student-faculty ratios, 11-to-1 as opposed to 14-to-1. And there's not comparison figures for the financial aid, but I suspect that your financial aid is probably north of 94%. Mine certainly was. And then I thought this last one you might be interested in. There's a 10% default rate nationally, but in fact, at Catholic colleges and universities, only about a 5% rate. So before Paul and then I say a little bit about Catholic education, if we go to the next slide, Stephanie. We're just going to talk about the first question for now, and you can take the slide down and show us all. Just like to take 5 minutes or so and maybe have 4 or 5 of you just say, what do you think it means for Georgian Court to be a Catholic university? And of course, my tip to you is we're going to ask the same question about Mercy University in a few minutes. So what does it mean for Georgian Court to be a Catholic university? Tammy?
So I'm a new board member, but I'm going to take a stab at this. I didn't attend a Catholic university, but I did attend K through 12 here in New Jersey at a Catholic school. And it's also one of the things that attracted me to be on this board. But I do think that the Catholic education tradition is very supportive in creating people and citizens who are change makers, who go out into the world and make a difference. And so I think that with lots of public universities and even some of the private ones, that this is a part of, this is a standard cookie cutter statement in most mission and vision statements for most organizations that are of higher education and universities and colleges and so forth. But I think in the Catholic universities and colleges, that this is where we have the leg up over the public institutions, is that it's not just lip service. We actually make it happen with the education that we're providing the students.
Great opening comment. Joyce and then Michelle.
So when I think of like a public university and a Catholic university, you can go to both institutions and you can walk out after however many years with a bachelor's degree or another degree. So you'll get the education. The difference between a Catholic university and a public university, there's a difference in mission. So they may share some foundational items around quality and things like that, but the Catholic university is one that has a mission grounded in the Catholic faith and takes much pride in ethics and making sure that those ethical principles are interwoven in the college experience, inside and outside the classroom.
Good. And before we go to Michelle, I want everyone to remember Joyce's emphasis on ethics, because that's going to turn out to be very prophetic. Michelle?
I'd like to build on that. The theological foundation, and in this case, the Catholic Theological Foundation, also imbues the institution that basically is suggesting that faith and spirituality are part and parcel of who the human being is and the reality in which we live. So in other words, I'm going to use the term, an old-fashioned term, the temporalities and the realities are, the concrete realities are right always before us, but it's a beckoning and a challenge and a support to look at life through a greater lens of meaning and purpose. And I also find and feel that it touches not only the intellect, the mind, but it's the heart and the soul, because that's really the essence of who we are. So I think a Catholic college, and I know we'll get to the Mercy tradition, is all lumped with this.
Good, thank you. One or two more, Vince, please. Vince, you're on mute. You need to unmute.
Sorry.
No, no
I
problem.
think that what we're doing is we're basically, a Catholic university is partly part of the mission of the whole church. And so education is one of the most important things that we do, as we carry out the mandate that Jesus gave us to teach. And we do that academically, but we do it also in a whole variety of other ways, adding the spiritual dimension and all of that. And I think that I have a friend who is down in West Virginia, and people criticize the school because it doesn't have all Catholic students, but his whole philosophy is that we don't educate Catholics, we educate because we're Catholic. That's part of what we do, in a whole bunch of ways. And I think that's important.
That's well said. And when you see that statistic, that even including schools like Notre Dame and others that are overwhelmingly Catholic students, nationally it's only 43% of the students. So that's become much more common. Paul, let's move to you, and we can go to the next slide, Stephanie, if we could, because Paul has a a slide that he wants to talk about, and then I will do a little bit more as well. Paul, off to you.
Thank you, Tom. So in keeping with this consideration of what it means to be a part of a Catholic university, it may be important for us to just pause and think about a couple of considerations of our time right now. The church is ancient, but the church is living and therefore in history and therefore moving. And so we're very much at a time now where, although next year is the 60th anniversary of the opening of it, we're only really now seeing signs of it fully being incarnated, and that is the understanding of the church from Vatican II. And so let's take a look, if we could, briefly at how we understand church. And to do that, I can bring up two of the key documents from the Council on the Church. The first, from Lumen Gentium, is that the church is the people, the pilgrim people of God, on the move, the people, and that these are called to the service of humanity, to the service of humanity. And although there are other tasks that are mentioned in Gaudium et Spes, this one is very interesting. Charged to scrutinize the signs of the times while interpreting them in light of the gospel. So I can read those over briefly in light of the fact that Vatican II is actually transitioning from an institutional model of church to very much a servant model of church. And so once again, the church is the pilgrim people of God, not the hierarchy, called to the service of humanity and not the Vatican institution, charged to scrutinize the signs of the times, interpreting them in light of the gospel, and not to obsession about the afterlife. That's very much a Vatican II understanding of church. And just briefly, the second point I want to make is just the word itself. For the longest time, we've understood the word Catholic along the lines of a Latin translation of that word. That Latin translation is universal. We do believe that the church is universal. It comes from two Latin words that mean turned into one. That implies that the emphasis is really on seeking uniformity. But if we go to the original Greek sense, because Catholic is actually a Greek word, we see that the roots come from according to the whole. And that means that the emphasis is on seeking wholeness and implies a unitive relationship among diverse members. So I think those two considerations are important as we reflect on what it means to be a Catholic university.
Great, thanks, Paul. And it's always kind of interesting, I think, particularly for those of us who are older, to think of Vatican II as being 50 years old, because it was such an important moment in our lives. We can go to the next slide, Stephanie, please. I want just quickly on these two slides to provide some context for our later discussion about being mercy in terms of some distinctive traits. Very important to understand that all of Catholic higher education is by definition more mission-centric. And I don't remember which of your trustees said this, but one of them made the distinction that mission drove Catholic education in a way that it does not drive public education and even many privates. Oftentimes we talk in the Catholic sector that historically Black institutions, women's colleges, Appalachian schools, there are portions of higher ed that are very mission-centric, but that's certainly true of all of Catholic higher ed. And Catholic higher ed, the religious dimension of mission is a unifying, it's a pervasive reality. It's not an add-on. It's at the center of the university and the college, and it provides the why and the how. When I arrived at Alvernia, I was told by the outgoing president and provost that they did not emphasize the Catholic Franciscan identity because they thought that that might turn some students off. And I didn't say anything, but I thought privately, well, then why bother to come here as opposed to going to one of the other 90 private colleges and universities in Pennsylvania? So the Catholic identity provides a kind of rationale for who you are. It provides a deep purpose. It provides the campus glue. It's the basis of your community, the appeal to the common good. Mission then is a source of inspiration, and it's also a source of your distinctiveness. And then at the bottom of that slide there, just 3 reminders that the Catholic intellectual tradition, and I'm giving you 2 of the most prominent names, Augustine and John Henry Newman, are part of the much broader tradition of Christian humanism. One of you mentioned this, but the church, the Catholic Church, is the largest non-governmental provider of higher ed in the entire world. There are 1,300 universities in the world. And of course, you know what the presence is of Catholic education in K-12. And then finally, just a comment about diversity. And I don't know the gentleman who made this comment about his friend in West Virginia. Sophia University in Japan has only 3% of its students are Catholic. The Gregorian, on the other hand, in Rome is 100% Catholic and men of studying for the priesthood. Think of places like Notre Dame and Georgetown with big research agendas. And then think of Georgian Court, which, by the way, is the most typical of Catholic colleges and universities, you know, as a regional university. Next slide, Stephanie. And then some kind of fun reminders. You are a Catholic university. You're not a seminary. You're not a parochial school. You're not a parish. You're not a social service agency. And I brainstormed one afternoon. I had never done this for this slide. These are all things that I think of as very distinct emphases of Catholic universities. I don't know of a single Catholic college or university that doesn't have a very strong liberal arts base, but with rare exception, Holy Cross is about the only prominent one. All Catholic colleges and universities have had a longstanding significant emphasis on professional education. Remember the comment I suggested you remember. I think it might have been Joyce who mentioned the word ethics. The fact that we require theology doesn't make us a distinctive place. The Lutherans require religious studies. The Baptists require scripture. But the Catholic College and University is the only one that requires philosophy and the only one that usually requires ethics. And so, in fact, 65% of Catholic college graduates say that they have had a strong emphasis on ethics in the classroom, not just in their ethics class, but in all classrooms. And 75% of them say they have benefited significantly from the emphasis on ethics, and that's opposed to 21% in the rest of higher ed. So that emphasis on ethics is very important. Close campus community, education of the whole person. One of you came very close to using this phrase. We educate the heart and the soul as well as the mind. Your Mulcahy Institute is going to put you in a leading edge in terms of social justice programming. Interfaith dialogue is near and dear to my heart. It was at the center of Alvernia's Catholic identity. We hosted a number of interfaith events. We had the leaders of the Jewish and Muslim communities on our board of trustees, and you have some real potential there given what's happening with the local Jewish community. We have a long tradition of being inclusive. I'm guessing that there's a large percentage of you on this call who are either first generation or you are the daughters and sons of first generation, and possibly back to grandparents who were immigrants. Catholic education, K-12, K-16, was the way that most of our families became part of the American country. And then finally, the emphasis on community service. Yes, there are other places that have alternative break programs. There are certainly service programs at public institutions, but Catholic higher education is a leader in that regard. So let's move on, Stephanie, if we can. And let's move now to governing for mission. And we can go to the next slide. And just some overall observations, just a couple of things that I want to put in front of you here. And I'm not going to read the slide to you,
I'm
except to
sorry, could I
remind-
ask a question? I apologize.
You certainly may, Ed, please.
You skipped on your last slide the comment of spiritual and religious development.
Right.
Now, I am the president of the St. Thomas More Catholic Center of Yale, which is the largest Catholic center in any of the Ivy League universities. You know, we have $100 million of endowment. We run a huge program. And we, the trustees, spend a huge amount of our time focusing on how do we get and 30% of the Yale students are stated as Catholic. We connect directly to about 10% of those. But we spend a lot of time talking about how do we connect the students more to the Mass and more to the sacraments. We last year baptized at Easter 20 students from Yale into the Catholic faith. But when I listen, we don't talk, when we talk about mission, we don't talk about the sacraments or Mass. And maybe I bring this up because later in my life, I've become a much more frequent participant in daily Mass, and most of the not-for-profit things I work on are all connected to Catholicism. But I see all of our discussion focused on action and social justice, which is clearly a big part of the church. But I don't see us ever talking about or communicating, are the 43% of our kids in school going to Mass, receiving the sacraments? That isn't, we don't talk, I never hear us talking about pastoral counseling as it relates to the faith. And that's just, particularly as I listen to the things you asked us to listen to beforehand, it just struck me as strange that in the, I guess, 4 years I've been on the board, the concept of, are kids going to Mass? Are they in the sacraments? Are people who are students who are coming, are any of them choosing to become Catholics? That doesn't seem to have ever been part of any of the discussion I've heard in any gathering of us trustees. End of my question or comment.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond, Ed, because obviously I'm not part of the Georgian court community. I guess I would say that my own experience is that the mission committee of the board at my institution looked at the sacramental life and also the life of the retreat ministry. We had pillars to the campus ministry and mission program, and those would have been among the pillars, but I can't speak to the situation at Georgian Court, obviously.
Well, I'll leave it to my other trustees as we move forward. I'd like to, it doesn't have to be today, I'd like to have a way to get a better understanding of what we do as relates to those issues, because I think I have a good understanding of what we do as it relates to service and social justice, et cetera. But I
Good.
Thank you.
And I think your question has particular significance for the mission committee, and that doesn't mean that the rest of the board wouldn't get informed, but that certainly is a topic that I think mission committees often take up. The only comments I want to make about this slide here is not to suggest that the board governs and the president leads, because the board obviously does some leadership and certainly the president governs. But just to remind you, someone made a great distinction earlier, talking about the board's expectations of Joe, that you expect him to be a leader and a manager. but you expect him to be delegating a lot of management. In the same way, that line between governing and leading is obviously a porous one. And then I just wanted to remind you, and those of you who have served on non-religiously oriented boards of trustees at colleges and universities, if you are a president of a Catholic college and university, you must live and lead the mission. We always say at ACCU, the president is the chief mission officer. The president is the one who must lead on mission and must embody the mission in the same way that she or he embody the brand. Having said that, it's now becoming increasingly common, whether it's a very prestigious national university or a regional college, that there are professional mission officers. And I put that in quotations because increasingly mission officers have gone through some training, they have advanced degrees, they have been immersed in at least one of the religious charisms, and they are a fundamental part of active leadership. And for reasons that you all are well familiar with, mission officers are far, far more likely to be lay people now than they were 10 years ago. And then the last comment is just to also say to you that as you think about your president's responsibilities in life, that just know that as a Catholic college or university president, that your president very likely thinks of his work as your president as vocational as well as career oriented. We can go to the next slide. And this next slide is also going to be a slide that we will be using with new trustees at orientation in the fall. And so I put it up there just as a little reminder for veteran trustees, and if you will, a kind of table of contents of what the board's perspective should be on mission. There are specific mission issues that the Board of Trustees would ordinarily have on its agenda, but I want to particularly emphasize the mission perspective on key issues. And let me do that by giving you a couple of examples. Financial aid strategy is something that should be informed by your mission. And I'm very confident it is, having heard several of you talk about the concern for the underrepresented groups. There are Catholic universities that are educating large numbers of undocumented students, for instance. That's very much mission oriented. The nature of institutes and centers for excellence. You have just established an institute on social justice. That is not one that you would find at most secular, prestigious colleges and universities, let alone at public institutions. So there are mission perspective on some key issues in the board. There are Catholic universities, there are actually a number of them that do not have mission committees, and they argue that mission should be part of the work of the entire board. I agree with that. I think that the mission should be incorporated into the work of the board and into the various board committees. But as we all know, if it's every place, it's probably likely no place. And so what I would say to you is that your own approach is the one I would prefer, where you have an active mission committee staffed by a professional mission officer, and you also find ways to integrate mission perspective into other things. Certainly the mission committee of the board, working with your mission officer and your president, should be responsible for developing a robust program of mission education for the board. At Alvernia, we had a curriculum that was a rotating curriculum over 3 to 4 years, so that during each trustee's tenure, each trustee's term, they would have a series of programs on Catholic higher ed, on the Franciscan charism, and on programs going on campus. Lay formation, you know this as well as I, the Mercy Sisters are a very vibrant order, but like the Jesuits and like the Benedictines and Dominicans, they are also diminished in numbers. And so the responsibility for mission for Georgian court 10, 20 years down the road is going to be dominated by lay people. So whether it's lay formation of the board or lay formation that Joe and Paul lead on campus with faculty and staff leaders, very, very important. And then obviously the policies, practices, and programs, and so forth. One of the things I would just say to trustees are that Joe and Paul, and even to some of you, if helpful, have rich resources to draw on from the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities that I serve. There is an active network of mission officers. So Paul is part of a vibrant group of mission officers. It's an increasingly sophisticated group, an increasingly sophisticated program. And Joe, of course, at the annual meeting is immersed in programs that you would not find at one of the secular associations. So we can move now, if we could, Stephanie, to the next slide. And governing for mission at New Jersey's Mercy University. No one can claim that in Pennsylvania because there's more than one. So you have a nice distinction you're able to claim there. Much of this next section is going to be a presentation by Paul on the new Mercy Covenant. So what I'm going to do first is give you some broad context for leading and governing for mission and say a little bit about sponsorship. Again, those of you who are new in the board will get more information on sponsorship in the fall. So we can go to the next slide then, please, Stephanie. I am a Bostonian, as you may have heard, even though I haven't lived there since 1976, there's still little vestiges of the accent. And so I paraphrase Tip O'Neill to remind us that all Catholic identity is local. There's a broad spectrum among the 220 Catholic colleges and universities, a wide spectrum of understanding and practice. And the gentleman from Yale's question before, what one would say that the response to Ed Smith's comments would vary widely across the 220 institutions, whether it's mass attendance or the vitality of the sacraments or the number of conversions each year. Some of you may know some of the Protestant traditions. I served as president of Presbyterian school, my first presidency before I returned home. And the Protestants, particularly the Presbyterians and the Lutherans, they talk about their religious identity on a spectrum from what I would call merely historic to infused. And you all can name a number of institutions that you know that were initially founded as Methodist or Baptist, and in fact, they no longer really have any tie whatsoever except history. And on the other hand, there is a place like Bob Jones or Liberty University where obviously the religious identity is front and center. And that spectrum is true with Catholic universities as well. Those of you who know Jesuits, Benedictines, Franciscans, as well as Mercies, know that those orders are all very different. The great joke that Chris Domes and I know for Franciscans is that if you've met one Franciscan university, you've met one Franciscan university. They're all very, 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 very different. And I might just point out to you, and you know this, I'm living in New Jersey, that one size doesn't fit all in terms of bishops. And we're not spending time in this session talking about the relationship with the bishop, but obviously depending on the bishop, you can have dioceses that are absolutely next to each other. My diocese was squeezed in between Philadelphia and Scranton, and those three dioceses had bishops that took entirely opposite approaches in terms of relating to the colleges and implementing ex cordia ecclesiae, the papal document. So again, generalizations are really pretty dangerous. Next slide, Stephanie. So what is sponsorship? You saw in that first slide when I put up the facts that 200 out of the 220 schools were founded by religious men or women. They are your sponsors. Interestingly, sponsorship is not a term that exists in canon law. Canon law is the law that governs the church as opposed to civil law. It's a very elusive concept, but it's absolutely essential, particularly for you at Georgian Court, in understanding why and how your university is considered Catholic. And I give you there a definition from one of the principal canon lawyers who works in this space and whom I've presented with. So you are the recognized Catholic organization of the Mercy Sisters. The legally formed entity is your university. And the Mercy Sisters are the vehicle through which you are designated as a Catholic university. There is a lot of different ways in which sponsorship is governed. The Mercy Sisters actually have been, in my humble opinion, revolutionary in the absolute best sense and cutting edge in the way in which they are handling sponsorship, because they are handling it at the national level through Mercy Higher Ed. Paul will say a little bit more about this. Most of the other Catholic colleges and universities are still handling it very much on an individual basis. My own university had what's called a two-tier system of governance, in which our Catholic identity was held by the 5 sisters who were the officers or the people in charge of their religious congregation. And they had certain reserved powers. You'll hear that phrase again when Paul speaks in a few minutes. And lastly, to remind you, I'm actually doing some very, very interesting and exciting consulting work up the road from you at Seton Hall. To give you the big difference here, the bishop is relevant for you in that the bishop has pastoral care of souls. The bishop has responsibility for the teaching of the faith, but your bishop does not have any governance role at Georgian Court University. At Seton Hall and other diocesan schools, the bishop is not only on the board of trustees, but often chairs the board of trustees. So the relationship with the bishop is less significant for a sponsorship university where the Catholic identity is coming from either the religious sisters or the religious men. And last slide here, before I turn back to you for a question. A Mercy sister, actually, and some of the Mercies on the call may know Sheila Carney. I'm very close friends with her sister, who is a Franciscan, and they have an interfaith relationship between the two of them, they joke. Sheila Carney gave a wonderful lecture when I was on the Assisi pilgrimage with other Franciscan presidents, in which she described our Franciscan charism as our Catholic flavor. And we started joking about types of ice cream. And so she said, you know, all of Catholic education is the ice cream, but the particular flavor is your religious charism. I thought that's a wonderful way of talking about it. It's the way in which your Catholic identity gets activated in a very particular way, in the way of culture, in the way of style. It doesn't tell you anything you don't already know, that the basic values of a Catholic college sponsored by the Dominicans, as opposed to the Mercies, as opposed to the Jesuits, the values aren't fundamentally different. The vocabulary is different. I noticed that you have mercy concerns. My Franciscan sisters had Franciscan core values, but in practical terms, it's the same thing. It's the fundamental emphases of the religious order. And reminding you that sponsorship, while there are sometimes some legal parts to this, it's much more about relationships. And that's why, like Alvernia, you are talking in terms of a covenant rather than sort of a legal document. After They're Gone is a very famous book done on religious sponsorship that was done quite a while ago by a religious sister, making the case for why lay formation was essential for the future. And to say the obvious, on many Catholic college campuses, unfortunately, the sisters or the brothers or the priests are already gone or almost entirely gone. I had one active Franciscan sister on my entire faculty and staff. I had several retired sisters who were very visible symbolically, but we had one member of the faculty, and except for the sister who was in the mission position, no one else in the administration. That is sadly much more true than not. And so it puts an enormous responsibility on the president, on the mission officer, to do lay formation on the campus, and on the board chair, the mission committee chair, and all of you to have lay formation on mission in your board of trustees. So if we could, Stephanie, could we go to our discussion question? And I'd like to take, this is our last discussion time. We can go now to the full screen. And before Paul gives some reflections on Mercy Higher Education and the Mercy Covenant, I'd like to hear all of you on the second question. We talked about what does it mean to be Catholic. So now what does it mean for Georgian Court to be a Mercy University? Julia? Julia?
Okay, well, I'll jump in. I'm a Sister of Mercy.
I
For
think
those
people
of
were waiting for one of the Mercies to talk first.
Well, for me, I've served a term on the Conference for Mercy Higher Education. So for me, being a Mercy University is being part of a network of 16 institutions around the country that are trying to promote the critical concerns in a variety of ways. Maybe they're their own subflavor of the Mercy, but it that at the core is trying to live in a more peaceful, just and merciful world. And we have a variety of ways of approaching that. I don't know any other secular institution that is trying to help its students to live in a more peaceful, just, and merciful world. I'm on the board at Salve. I'm also on the board. I'm also on the board at Carlo. But at Salve, we have a relatively new president. And at the town meeting where she was meeting the faculty and the students, the faculty at Salve speak about the mission as though it's theirs. They're their critical concerns. It's not about Sisters of Mercy, it's about them. They've internalized it, it's become them. And I think that probably is the same thing that is true of faculty at Georgian Court, since we've had these critical concern weeks for quite a while now.
Good. Great first comment. Frank Coleman?
Well, the way that I think about it is I think, what am I supposed to be doing as a trustee at a Mercy institution? And I'm supposed to be, with intent, looking at the 5 Mercy core values in any part of my role as a trustee, and whether it's the role of advise and consent to the president, whether it's the role of financial oversight, whatever the role is, what I'm charged to do is to look at that role and think about that role and all of its aspects within the context of those 5 Mercy values, and intentionally ask myself the question, how does respect play into this? How does integrity play into this? How does justice and compassion, how do they play into this? And to constantly be of the mindset of thinking about that actively as I go about the duty of giving advice or analyzing a problem or receiving information about the university.
Great. Others? John and then Vince. John first and then up to Vince.
What comes to me is when I chaired the presidential search committee, as was mentioned earlier, and the committee developed criteria for the new president, totally built around the Mercy values as a principle, and then secondarily about the financial and face time type issues. And the concerns were that up until that point, all the leaders of the university have been women, vocational women. And the selection of Joe was built around his commitment to each of the values. And we discussed each of the values in great detail. And then when we interviewed Joe and other candidates, we used that as a measure of our selection process. And I feel that Joe has fulfilled that. The Lord led us on the right path. And it's to this day, it's the most critical differentiator of Georgian Court University in the education market in New Jersey.
So those of you who are new trustees, you just heard probably, if not the best, the most important example I could think of what it means for the board to govern for mission. Exactly the way John described the position statement for the presidency and the framework that they used to interview. That would be absolutely at the top of the list as far as what it means for a board to govern for mission. So thank you, John, for that. Vince?
Well, I think I went to Mercy High School, Camden Catholic. We had 50 Sisters of Mercy there. And it was there that I really got my love for teaching and education. But it was really drummed into us that they were there, the Sisters of Mercy, for the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. They used to say ignorant, but now they say uneducated. And I think that shadows everything that we do. Certainly, university is more concerned with education, but there's also woven into that fabric is concern for the poor and the sick and all that. So I think that's a pretty strong thing that was just, I think you picked it up by osmosis by going to this school that was almost all Sisters of Mercy teaching. You know.
And you might remember some of your earlier comments when I asked you why you were serving on the Georgian Court Board. A couple of you, particularly a couple of the alums, some of the new trustees who are alums, talked, they didn't use the word charism, but they essentially talked about the impact that the Mercy charism had had on them. So that's a great example of that.
I just want to jump in on Vince's reference to the poor, sick, and ignorant. I still prefer ignorant because one can be highly educated and still ignorant.
Good.
Amen to that. Jim Andrews, and then Bob Mulcahy.
Let me say I was ignorant of the fact that Camden Catholic was run by the Mercy Sisters. I've been there, and I had the opportunity to do some in-service days with their faculty, and I don't think it ever came up. But interesting, the Mercy Sisters have been with me throughout the last few years. Sister Cora Marie Billings, I've used her for, you may know her. She did some days of reflection for me when I was with the Diocese of Camden. And of course, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention how great an instructor Sister Mary Paula was at Georgian Court, who had a tremendous impact when she taught one of the classes that I attended. I always said she was the toughest, but the best instructor I've had at Georgian Court, bar none. So.
That's the Bob Mulcahy, I think you had your hand up.
I reached for my sandwich.
Unknown caller.
Anyone else want to speak to what does it mean for Georgian Court to be Mercy?
I think in addition to what I want to call in a broader sense of the word issue focus, for example, around the critical concerns and our orientation in terms of social justice, it's all in the broader context, I think, of compassion, hospitality, care, and development, holistic development. So and so that's what I want to say in terms of the mission. It's truly a broad framework into which particular foci fall, from my perspective.
Yeah, Vince?
Yeah, I just say, I think we're moving now, you were talking more about moving into lay formation. And I think it's important to realize that Catherine McCauley didn't want to be a nun. Basically, she had to do that to do her mission, which was taking care of things. And so I think that her story is just such a powerful story that we sometimes, if we haven't looked at that film on Catherine, I forget the name of it now, but it's really powerful. And I think that's really where we are. We're kind of moving back into that area today in the church. I think that's a good thing. Yep.
Thank you.
I have a question. I wonder what percent of our student body actually thinks of the mercy values? Or do they think about, well, you know, it's convenient. They have a high level of scholarship and awards, and I can get what I need by going there. And I wonder how many of them, if you took them and asked them, how many of them even know what they are?
Jim, at one level, you may be right. I don't know that a 17-year-old knows that when they come in, but as I've often described as part of this process of Renew GCU, when we talk about the intellectual renewal, it actually starts before I become president, and it was the incorporation of the Mercy Corps values into our general education requirements. So the Gen 101 course starts with a service requirement and reflections on those values. And then there's a second course along those lines, but it culminates actually in a senior service project. So they may not know what mercy means before they come to the university, and they may be attracted because of financial aid and location and matters of convenience. And we certainly know that. We know that 90% of our students come from Ocean and Monmouth County. But by the time they leave, especially if they're a four-year, freshman going through the process, they've really been integrated into the Mercy Corps values as reflected locally. And to Tom's point about the locality of Mercy values, they vary by each university. But they are also part of the universal notion of the critical concerns and the celebration of Critical Concerns Week every year is something where they're actually doing presentations and working with their faculty members going on that. So, I think on the front end, they don't know it, but by the time they graduate, I think a significant number of them are pretty well-versed in the mercy values.
Well, that would be the sign of our success if we knew how many were in the beginning and how many had picked it up when they were through their 4 years.
And Jim, there's actually an assessment tool from ACCU that actually can get right at that. Joe's answer not only is the answer that I was suspecting would be true for you, but it would be the answer that you'd hear at the other regional Catholic universities that have been really serious about mission. The number and percentage of our students who enter because we're Franciscan or because we're Mercy is pretty modest. Out of that number, the number who know what Franciscan and Mercy is, as opposed to just thinking positively of it, that's an even smaller number. But boy, by the time they walk across the stage, that may be the thing they know best about our institution. So, I think I'm going to go up to Alicia, so I'll just make two comments. John's comment about the what I call core values, you call them the Mercy concerns. That is the driver for you in terms of your identity. And frankly, Joe, what Joe said about your freshman seminar is something that we finally did at Alvernia. It's part of the freshman curriculum, and then there's a way to bring it back in senior year. The other thing I guess I would say, and Chris and I have both been presidents of Franciscan schools for many, many years. We would probably say that of all of the religious orders of women who sponsor institutions, we would tend to say that the Mercies have the strongest academic and intellectual reputation. And so one of the ways I would answer what it means to be a Mercy University is that it suggests to me more of an academic and intellectual brand along with all of the social justice. And I think the Franciscans, we would tend to say that the Mercies have a stronger academic and educational tradition than we do. I see Chris nodding. So that may be something that's too close to home for you to claim, but I think that's a real advantage you have. I'm going to go up to Alicia.
I just want to jump in here to clarify this core values versus critical concerns. I think it might have been John Cecils who went to a grandchild's graduation at Misericordia a few years ago and saw that they have different Mercy values there. Than the Mercy values are the characteristics of Mercy: respect, compassion, integrity, service, and justice. And that's how they are organized at Georgian Court. And they permeate everything, including flags as you enter the campus. Or I don't know if they're still there, but they were there. The critical concerns are actually articulated at a chapter of the Sisters of Mercy. And they are, you know, they're everywhere in the things that we do. And Georgian Court's approach to that has been to have select a critical concern for a particular year, work on it, and have, you know, those lectures and everything revolve around that.
That's helpful. I'm going to go to Alicia and Bob Mulcahy and then turn things to Paul for the last part of our program. Alicia?
Thank you. I just wanted to, I guess, give an alumna to the speaker before that was asking about the Mercy core values. They come in understanding them, come in leaving them. So when I was looking at schools, my father was dragging me around everywhere looking for schools. At that same time, I had a cousin who was my age and one of my siblings battling heroin addiction, and my home life was chaos. And my father, I mean, I needed centering and support, and my father recognized that. So driving in, those flags are still there, they're signs. Driving in, my dad was reading off the Mercy core values, you know, respect, integrity, justice, compassion, service. And he was like, this is what you need right now. So it was an immersive experience when I was there. It was integrated in everything, in every course I did, in every project I did. And it just organically became ingrained in me. And then I immediately, upon graduation, left and began to advocate for families impacted by addiction. And I think that the Mercy core values and my education was a major factor in what I have done in my adulthood. So I think that a lot of students are in similar situations as I was, and they needed grounding or centering, and having those values gave them that,
Good.
whether they realized what it was or not.
Bob?
I just wanted to ask Chris, I remember conversations he had with me, and it's kind of a way to wrap it up. But Chris, I remember you talking to me about how impressed you were with the interviews with the students who were here. Am I correct?
Absolutely. One of the things I found, and the entire accreditation team at the time found so impressive about the students at Georgian Court was, in fact, they could articulate very clearly the Mercy core values. They could articulate them. They were integrating them. They were living them out. And I think one of the things, it's a contemporary expression of a tradition that's been around for a long time. So it's they're taking it and owning it themselves. And the role I think of charisms is allowing young people to embrace an understanding of of that tradition today. It's giving them ownership. And I think Georgian Court has done an exceptional job of really integrating those core values, not just in the classroom, in an intellectual way, academic way, but also outside the classroom as well, in athletics and student services and leadership and other ways, and certainly in mission and ministry. So those are experiences that I witnessed and recognized and heard directly from many students when we were on your campus.
Great. So Paul, I'm going to turn to you, and my last slide, Paul, is just going to be a summary slide. So you have the floor for the rest of our time.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Stephanie, you can advance to the next slide, please. And in an interest of the clock, I will be mindful of how much time we're using for this. So that last discussion we just had about what Mercy Higher Education is all about made me brings to mind for me that we do have a sense of it. I prepared this slide with 4 basic characteristics, but listening to what we were sharing, a lot of what we said is already covered here. So I'll go kind of quickly through it. The first one is we understand that for the Mercy charism, the experience of hospitality is very important. We take the task of welcoming seriously. And part of that means being committed to the reality, not just a spirit, but a reality, a full reality of respecting inclusivity. All are welcome. I think it's good for us to remember that Mercy Day, September 24th, is a commemoration of the opening of the doors of a house where people were welcomed in Dublin in 1827. So that's a very important first thing we can say. And as I said, we've already been talking about. The second is a pedagogy of seeing reality. So what's encouraged is a deep encounter with reality that initiates a cycle of critical self-reflection. The third is very much a humanizing education for the common good. So in other words, we encourage students to find creative and courageous ways to put skills and knowledge to use for the greater good. And finally, educating for hopeful realism. I think that gets right back to respecting and honoring the wisdom of Catherine Macaulay, who would instruct her sisters to take one day only in hand at a time. In other words, students often, because of their age, want to see action, want to see change now. And so this is a kind of a tempering vision of being hopeful, because without hope, we can't envision possibilities, but also to recognize that it's not going to come tomorrow necessarily. We are instructed to take each day, one day in hand at a time. Steph, please, the next slide. And so we're at a point now where we are to consider this momentous, actually, change in the way that sponsorship occurs all around a beautiful word and image from the Bible, covenant. So in this discussion, because I understand that everyone has been sent an actual copy of the covenant, and I think the other members of not only the new, but the other members, the standing members of the board had already seen it before, there's no real need for me to pick apart the text. In favor, I would say, of just speaking about the importance of the spirit of what covenant means. So the word covenant, well, first of all, now, so during the past year, the Conference of Mercy Higher Education has been engaged in a discernment process about the kind of relationships that will promote the mission of Mercy Higher Education, knowing that they face certain challenges of sustaining their sponsored ministries in light of the decline in the presence of sisters on campuses. The sisters are considering new models of cooperation that recognize the graces of both religious and other lay members of the university. So back to that beautiful biblical concept, that image of covenant. The word evokes the rich biblical history of relationships. That word, again, is very important, I know, for us at Georgian Court, where we often say relationships matter. But certainly in the context of covenant, the biblical history of relationships between God and God's people, fidelity to the covenant with God, is seen as the thread which ties together all of the ancient stories of Israel. The best way to understand the true meaning and spirit of covenant is to contrast it with another word, contract, which itself is an important term, and Catholic social teaching underscores the importance of contracts in the social order. But a contract is basically a quid pro quo legal arrangement built on a conditional relationship. Covenant, on the other hand, suggests both an abiding relationship and, in the true biblical sense, represents a fully free action of the will to enter into new relationship with the other. So the spirit of the word is very important here. I think it was an excellent option that the sisters chose to focus on the word covenant to describe the relationship of sponsorship that is now moving forward. So practically speaking, the language of covenant signals that the sisters are pulling back from their fiduciary responsibilities and moving forward with an opportunity for board, president, faculty, and staff to develop greater ownership of their shared mission. Sponsorship realized in a covenant relationship means that all members of the community must work together to understand, reflect on, share, and work conscientiously to promote the mission. The covenant represents a new way to envision the promise of Catholic higher education. Many people, in fact, are saying that this mercy covenant approach will serve as a model for other Catholic universities. The challenges ahead will thus pertain to the development of relationships, practices, policies, and communities committed to the shared work of mercy in education. And so, in terms of a very, very brief overview, as I said, because everyone has a copy of this, and just to say that Tom highlighted the term reserved powers when he was introduced the covenant. I just want to say that you can get a really good sense of those reserved powers as they are articulated in the document itself. Okay, where under mutual accountabilities and mutual commitment, those are specified. But if we take a look at the preamble, I don't know if you have the document in front of you, but I can tell you that it consists of an excerpt from the Constitutions of the Sisters of Mercy that contextualizes the spirit of the covenant, and it boils down to this: that the sisters sponsor institutions to address their enduring concerns, we call them critical concerns, and to witness to Christ's mission. They, their co-workers, and those they serve all endeavor to model mercy and justice and to promote systemic change. After that, the preamble moves on to an excerpt from Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which Tom also introduced earlier. That's Pope John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution on Catholic higher education. And this section lists the essential characteristics of the university community as such. And these are a continuing reflection in light of the Catholic faith upon the growing treasure of human knowledge, to which it seeks to contribute by its own research, fidelity to the Christian message, an institutional commitment to the service of the people of God and of the human family in their pilgrimage to the transcendent goal which gives meaning to life. And first and foremost, I should have said earlier, a Christian inspiration, not only of individuals, but of the university community as such. From the preamble are 3 sections, once again, on mutual commitment, mutual accountabilities, and then a section on the actual implementation with a plan and process. In closing, I'll just say that October of this year is the actual time of the signing when presidents and mission officers are going to be gathering for this ceremony, which is actually a big deal in the history of the Conference of Mercy Higher Education. If I can answer any questions, I'm happy to.
Thank you, Paul.
And maybe Joe
No,
can.
Tom's gonna do
Stephanie,
it.
well, let's go to the next, the last 2 slides just very quickly. So this is not for discussion, folks. This is a question I want to leave you with as a result of this retreat. Be thinking about how the board might help enhance Georgian Court's Catholic Mercy mission, something for future understanding. And Stephanie, the last slide. And again, this is just meant as a summary, and Joe has these slides if anyone is interested in them. The only thing I will just say to you is the 3rd slide from the end. You are reading and hearing a lot about justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I think those of us in leadership at ACCU see these as coming out of our mission. So rather than being as something separate and adding on, it should be seen as a very important part of your mission, and certainly would be very, very much consonant with your mercy charism. And a reminder that that you're very fortunate to have the mercy charism as a way to shape your culture and your identity. And I would say that I would agree with Paul very strongly that the mercy covenant and the mercy approach to higher education is prophetic, and I think you will see other congregations follow that in the years to come. If we can go to the full screen now, Stephanie. Let me just say it's been a pleasure to be with you for these hours today. I'm really impressed with the blend of experienced trustees and wonderful new trustees who are active participants, and I wish you the best in your work. And I will now happily turn things back to Joe and to Bob.
Tom, thank you so much. I think it's been terrific. Certainly, it follows a lot of the things that we learned a couple of years ago. And I think it's very relevant in today's world for all of us. I want to say one thing about the Mercy Covenant that we're going to sign in October. It basically means that the board has a responsibility for this university, so that it's up to us to make it or to fail it. And so that is somewhat different than you'll see in other places with other responsibilities. But as Tom said, I'm sure it's going to come to that eventually. So when we get to that, we will discuss it with you. But based on what Joe and I know about it and what we've been told, there's a greater responsibility for this board to be responsible for what's here. And I think the order has been very foresighted in how to approach these things for the future. We have a closing prayer, but I'm going to ask you in it so you can think about it for a minute. I'm going to ask each of the new trustees for a 1-sentence or 1-line feeling about what they thought about today's retreat. As we bring our meeting to a close, take a minute or two to reflect on your experience of our time together. What are you thinking or feeling as you prepare to leave this meeting? How has it been for you? Try to capture your experience in a word or a phrase or a brief sentence. And before we say our closing prayer, I would ask that you share with us a word or phrase that reflects your experience with this particular meeting. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Thank you, Joyce.
So the word I would use is inspirational.
Alicia,
Uh,
go ahead.
Enthusiastic.
Good. Thank you, Monsignor. James.
Thankful for the opportunity. Thankful.
I would say a deep sense of gratitude.
Time well spent.
For me, I'll give it a sense of service. I was fortunate enough to go to a Jesuit school, and I see this as a continuation of giving back the same values that I learned from the Jesuits, so similar to the Mercy Sisters.
Have I missed anybody? If, everybody agree that it was very worthwhile? Okay. Let us conclude by saying, let us pray. May the God of mercy bless and direct the future of Georgian Court University. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very, very much. I know it's been long, but I think it's been worthwhile. And certainly we hope that this has been a good introduction, not only for the new trustees, but also reminders for the existing trustees. So thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it. Look forward to meeting in person. And we'll have some communication over the summer because I have to assign committees, and we will do that. So thank you very, very much. Joe, is there anything you want to say?
Just, we will be providing Tom's slides to all the members of the board. We'll also post it on our portal. And at some point, we'll probably gather the 7 new trustees together too, so we can give you a little bit of a deeper dive on the exciting news with regard to the land sale, just so that you're completely up to speed on that. So a little bit for that to come in the next few weeks. But again, my gratitude and thanks to Tom Flynn for leading us through this, for Paul for your insights with regard to the Catholic University and the Mercy Covenant. Thank you, everybody, for a very educational retreat and a very productive board meeting. Thank you.
And
Have a great summer.
I'll make one comment. May the same God that we share with our neighbors down the street look positive over their activities.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. God bless everybody. Thanks.
Blessings.